Hi, my name is Rachel Ankeny. I'm going to be presenting today out of some work I've been doing with my team, which is part of the Food Values Research Group at the University of Adelaide. And we use social science approaches, as you'll see in a minute, to look at a range of issues in agriculture. But today's focus is going to be on gene editing, which is a project that's been funded by the MLA that is of particular interest, we think, for both sheep and beef farmers. So to tell you a little bit about our research group, our overall take is that we're interested in understanding how food-related attitudes are shaped. And in particular, we're interested in values associated with food and agriculture, and have done a range of research projects that you can see there relating to things like farm animal welfare, genetic modification, and values associated with production practices. Social license is also a major theme, and that'll come up a bit later. But mainly today, I want to talk then about our gene editing project. So a bit of background. This probably won't be news to a lot of people involved in the industry. We know there are continued high levels of meat consumption in Australia, but there's also increasing concern among Australians about production practices. And this in turn is causing producers to grow anxious about perceptions, so-called social license, and potential impacts on the industry. I think one of the punchlines of the talk is that I do think the major impacts on the industry are likely to come from attempts to reduce red meat consumption associated with environmental concerns. But it is the case that use of emerging technologies can often cause concerns to emerge. And that's what we're focused on today with regard to gene editing. So a brief overview of the project that we're running for MLA. We know gene editing is becoming rapidly available and being deployed in locations including North and South America. Gene editing, as you might know, involves introduction of genes or speeding up of genetic gain in order to produce useful attributes in the resulting animals. We have no available research on Australian views, and our project then is looking both at producer and community views. We think that, and MLA thinks that this is extremely important because of the potential threat to social license, but also needing to produce spaces in which we can be more collaborative with regard to understanding people's concerns or hopes for technologies like gene editing. As I mentioned, we use social science methods to look at drivers of opinion, particularly with regard to certain applications of gene editing in livestock, and to think about how to better engage. So the methods, we're using online kinds of methods in part because of COVID, but they've worked really well because they allow us to access a range of diverse populations. And we do a form of focus groups. This is bookended with a representative survey. And the representative survey gave us sort of a sense of what people think on average, whereas the focus groups allow us to drill down and get more information about what it means when they say they're for or against something, or they're concerned, or they have hopes for something. We're using what's called Q methodology, which lets us look at shared ways of thinking. And this is particularly important because it allows us to get around demographics or beyond demographics to see where people have shared values. Again, rather than just for or against voting, as we might get in a straight ahead survey, we've asked people to weigh up their values and their understandings. This may mean they have bad information, but we focus on what the values mean as much as whether the information is accurate or not. With producers, we've also done a survey and more in-depth interviews. And one of the eventual outputs when the project concludes later this year will be some guidelines associated with community engagement. So just some initial findings. This is still research underway. These are findings on producer attitudes. And what you can see with regard to gene editing, we asked about different kinds of outcomes of gene editing. And we found that people were particularly interested in switching on or switching off genes. But there was a lot of support for introducing genes of all kinds, either the heritable ones or non-heritable. a lot more nervousness about introducing genes cross species than there was introducing genes from the same species. We also asked what kinds of applications they found most acceptable. And you can see here there was a range. Things that made them nervous included cosmetic traits and also changing the sex ratio. But things like reducing environmentally harmful impacts had strong support, as did reducing the need for certain kinds of painful or stressful procedures, enhancing disease resistance, but also enhancing meat quality. Things like altering the temperament of livestock might be described as more kind of neutral or somewhat in between when we look across all of the responses. So when we turn now to the community groups, basically a little more detail about how we did that. We combined information provision, videos that gave some information, some scenarios, the value rankings that I mentioned a minute ago, and discussion that we facilitated. We made sure to keep them on track through the facilitation, and we're in the process of analyzing a huge amount of information thematically and also using the value ranking kinds of methods that I talked about. You can see here day 3 looked in particular at the applications such as creating polled cattle and sheep, increasing disease resistance, and making meat that was gene edited. So just some examples, I'm not going to go through all of these. The kinds of value rankings or Q-source that we did ran the gamut of types of issues. So we talked about broader issues, whether they were nervous about safety or gene editing being against natural order. We talked about whether they'd be willing to consume meat produced from gene edited animals. And as I mentioned, we talked about applications, environmental benefits of gene editing, whether gene editing should be used to improve economic viability. And finally, we also talked about what they wanted to see in terms of regulation or legal controls and who should be involved in those processes. So some initial community results with the warning that we're still analyzing this. One of my favorite lines from these groups, no zombie animals allowed. The consumers or the community, we did go beyond just people who consume meat to a small number of people who are non-meat consumers. They were concerned and nervous about altering livestock temperament or changing the ratio of males and females, even if it was to increase muscle mass and have positive environmental effects by reducing the number of animals. This was in contrast to producers who were more neutral or even more positive, and seemed to hinge on the idea that we shouldn't change what is natural. Now, obviously, livestock animals are, at a stretch, not even natural as it stands now, but they saw gene editing as going beyond limits about what we should be doing. They were much more supportive of gene editing applications to enhance disease resistance and things that they saw as really fundamental to the welfare of the animal. So why do we focus on values rather than sort of educating people? Livestock, but there's something still going on with these community members and what they see as what should be the limits. And in particular, this kind of idea that the natural can be highly problematic. There's also clear differences in what they think is an acceptable risk, either to human health, let's say, from consuming meat produced from gene-edited animals, or more generally, risks about what the implications might be for the animals themselves or the environment. And looking at values allows us to really start to understand what they see as an acceptable risk, and in turn, what they see as the necessary benefit to trade off against that risk. So we think by looking at these values and asking people about some of the complexities, we can get at what consensus might look like in this domain between some of the applications that might have real prospects and what the community is going to be willing to countenance or to buy. And I think this is more generally a lesson when we think about new innovations, be they genetic or otherwise, the need to think about what the community is concerned about, and therefore mounting an engagement strategy that helps to address or at least engage with those sorts of concerns, rather than taking guesses about what they might be concerned about. So we know more generally, this wasn't a surprise, that shared values are 3 to 5 times more important for formation of opinions than knowledge. And this goes a little bit against maybe our traditional way of thinking. If we just give people information, they'll come on board, they'll see the light, and so on. I think values are tricky because they involve not just information, but experiences, gut feelings. We saw a lot of splashover from concerns about designer babies and using genetics with humans into the domain of using genetics with livestock. But we do believe that our findings to date are going to provide a really good basis for coming up with some account of what some of the shared values are. Clearly, livestock animal welfare is a very highly valued thing, and improving it on a constant basis, highly valued. We also found, setting aside the minority that were opposed to livestock production, the strong majority still intend to continue eating red meat and large quantities of red meat in line with the statistics that we're well familiar with. But as we think about not just gene editing, but more generally uses of genetics in these domains, we'll need to think about how to engage with these community concerns, particularly about applications. And I think the environmental benefit ones are extremely interesting, because to produce environmental benefit, let's say, and perhaps decrease the total number of animals seems like a good thing on the surface, but people have grave concerns about how that's going to be done. And so given the environment is high on most people's lists, I think that's going to be a particularly important domain in which we're going to need to think about how to engage with the community. Finally, it's really important to think about transparency. And I know this is always a tricky one with producers. So in part, we need to think about agriculture and the way in which it can become transparent, despite the fear of attracting attention from activists and otherwise. It is clear that our regulatory systems are quite robust compared to lots of other places in the world. And we need to continue to make that visible to the community and make visible the best practices that producers agree on and tend to use. But producers in turn need to think about openness as a way to cultivating trust rather than a way to perhaps stir up dissent. And one way to do that is through this sort of focus on the underlying values rather than the technical information, and engaging the public around these kinds of novel and emerging issues. So thank you for listening.